Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen, and this is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, a gathering place for fellow fiends the world over to discuss all things freaky and frightening. If you want to be part of the conversation, and I hope you do, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, maybe go back and check out some of our previous episodes, leave a comment, and most importantly, let us know the fright flicks you'd like to discuss in the future. That kind of connection is exactly what we're looking for, and it really does make a difference. We're all about sharing the scare, and we want to hear from you. Bearing no resemblance to the original story by Edgar Allan Poe, Universal's atmosphere-drenched 1934 offering, The Black Cat, from Austrian expatriate Edgar G. Ulmer, is a superior piece of filmmaking, made all the more historic for marking the first and finest on-screen teaming of horror icons Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. The storyline of mysterious Dr. Vitus Werdegast, played by Lugosi, and an American couple taking refuge during a rainstorm in a secluded Hungarian mansion is a bit muddled, due in part to studio interference and editing by Universal, but Ulmer and his two leads make up for it with sheer presence, swift pacing, and a dreamlike atmosphere of death, as one character puts it, that pervades throughout. Karloff, as resident Satanist scientist Ulmer and Lugosi square off admirably, playing a figurative and literal game of chess with one another, their characters' dark history revealing itself layer by layer, with the tension mounting to a memorable and satisfying climax. The delight in watching these two hugely popular stars at the top of their game is palpable, and one can easily forgive the minor flaws in logic and dull supporting characters. The director's heightened noir is stylized, to be sure, but undeniably engaging, with special kudos to Charles D. Hall's exemplary art direction. Tonight, we celebrate 90 years of The Black Cat, an extraordinary slice of Universal classic horror ripe for rediscovery by a new generation. I'm very excited to chat about this first teaming of Karloff and Lugosi on its 90th anniversary, and I've got an awesome panel to chat about it with me, so let's bring everybody in. And let's say hello to Bobby Zier of Lugosi Theater.
Hi, guys. I have returned.
Aaron Abishan of Discover the Horror.
Hello, everybody. Very excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite pre-code horrors.
And everybody's favorite G fan, good old Stan Hyde, beaming in from Canada.
Vancouver, Canada. Hi, really happy to be here. I love this movie, so it's going to be fun.
And we are here to chat about The Black Cat from 1934, celebrating its 90th anniversary. Thank you all for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. This is one of the movies that I saw that was one of my introductions to the Universal Classics that wasn't a monster movie. And I remember seeing the climax of this movie in late at night, and it completely freaking me out and going, I didn't realize you could do things like that in a movie. It stuck with me for a very long time. I'm very excited to be chatting about it tonight. Bobby, can you tell us how you came to this film for the first time? I know you're a huge Bela Lugosi fan.
I remember I saw it on an AMC. It was like during October, and I was just watching the different monster movies they were showing.
Like their big Monster Fest?
The big Monster Fest, yeah. And then I didn't know quite what to make of it at first. You know, it was different. It was so different from the other ones. But I remember when I first saw it thinking, there's no way Bela Lugosi is the hero of this. There's no way. And by the time I was convinced that I guess he is the hero, that's when the ending happened. But yeah, I remember really liking it. And then I was able to watch it again more often when I got the Bela Lugosi collection on DVD, and that's when I really was able to rewatch it and see how wonderful it is.
Aaron, how about you?
You know, I'm bad at this question generally. You should know that by now.
I do know that by now, but I'm going to keep asking anyway.
And I'll just keep saying my brain doesn't work like that, especially with films like this that has just continued to grow in my esteem literally every time I watch it. So I don't remember the first time I saw it, but I do remember that every time I think of Universal horror films, I think of Frankenstein first because it's my most important horror film ever. And then the very next film that I think of is The Black Cat. It's outside the monster cycle because I think that, kind of as you alluded to in the beginning, not just the beginning or not just the end of the film, which is certainly shocking for 1934. But the themes, the maturity of the film, the maturity of the subject matter, the sort of the different places that the film really goes, the metaphors that it plays with, makes this a film that I think is deserving of being in the very highest part of the Universal canon and remembered that way. So I'm just super excited to get into that part of it, and I'll let Stan talk about his first memories.
Cool. And Stan, let's bounce over to you.
So I'm a monster kid. Well, sure, I first saw Black Cat on like the local Nightmare Theater. And the thing about it is, it's not a monster movie. It really is a horror movie compared to monster movies. But sometimes that shook me as a kid. Like, no, I don't know if I want to watch this. Like, it's got no monster in it. But there's something about Black Cat from even the earliest viewing that it's just different. Partly it's the camera work and everything like that. You know, it's also one that's growing over the years. Like, the more often I see it, the better I think it is. So that's a big part of it.
Well, and that's a great place to kind of dive in, because I think what tends to lead in terms of people thinking of what makes this film is important, it's the first teaming of Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi following their star turns in Dracula and Frankenstein, respectively. And this was, Lugosi had, well, actually, if somebody else wants to speak to kind of like the Lugosi history prior to coming back.
So after his enormous success in Dracula, originally he was going to do Frankenstein. Then he turned it down, and Boris Karloff played the monster. And then he did Murders in the Rue Morgue. But then after that, Universal didn't renew his long-term contract. He did some independent films. He did White Zombie, did Shandu the Magician for Fox. And, Bela spent money as soon as he got it. So he already declared bankruptcy. So his career was weird. It was at its height, but like on shaky ground. So for him to get back at Universal, it was a huge deal.
And the fact that he was getting to go toe to toe with Karloff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because I was rewatching it, and it was interesting because where Boris is his contract had just got renewed. He was doing great. Whereas Bela Lugosi, it was a turning point in his career.
Yeah. And in terms of where Karloff was, he was really coming back with a lot of power in terms of his new contract.
Yeah, Karloff was, he was in his ascendancy at that point. And it was an ascendancy, frankly, that I feel like was an uninterrupted trajectory, generally speaking. So, he was kind of always on the way up. And it was always kind of tragic, I felt like, obviously, what happened with Lugosi and how Universal dealt with Lugosi. So it's interesting to see them in this film in what would become some of their most equal footing. Obviously Son of Frankenstein it changes the footing, but they're both monstrous in that. And this one, they're both very human, they're both very equal, and they're both coming from the same background, but at very, very different perspectives. And it is nice to see Karloff get to wander into a role that he didn't play too often, like the one that he plays here, where he is the out and out bad guy. And it's also fascinating. I'm sure we're all aware that there was another set of scenes in a different version of this where Lugosi was as equally unhinged. And I think that would have been fascinating. The alternate history version of this, I think, would be really fascinating to see.
Stan, I see you nodding. Do you want to talk about that alternate version?
Yeah, I've written a lot about alternate versions, actually, for things. So I am fascinated. I think in some ways, the stuff that was cut, it probably helped the movie to make Lugosi an unambiguous hero. But the stuff that's in there where both of the guys would have been kind of lusting after Joan,
Yeah, Jacqueline Wells.
Yeah, Jacqueline Wells. It's fascinating, and some of the stuff but it's also strange how some of the strongest stuff, like Karloff's walk through his preserved sacrificial victim room, was snuck in as part of the alternate version. So there's a bunch of stronger stuff that was cut, and then apparently, the story is that Ulmer thought that Lemley wouldn't notice, wouldn't get what was going on in the preservation room, and so they shot that too, which is like, it's so perverse. But I'd be fascinated to see the version. It's too bad there's not the alternate world version where both. I just think it would have kind of maybe overweighed that film. Like, if he's bad and Karloff's bad, they're both trying to basically rape, the innocent virginal star that it would be hard to, who to hang on to. I guess if David Manners was a little stronger, maybe he would be the hero. But because he's kind of an interesting leading guy, kind of observing what's going on, but not really stepping in there, even when some weird stuff happens. So when
he's the human version of a moist towelette.
He really is. When he wakes up on the train and Bela is putting his hand over his hair, and he just kind of is watching. It would be amazing to see an alternate version, actually, too.
Basically, like the basic story is we've got David Manners and Jacqueline Wells. They're newlyweds, and they end up sharing a train compartment with Lugosi's character, Vitus Werdegast, and he is on his way back to exact revenge on his former army pal, Ulmer Polzeg. And they end up going along, and they get in a car accident, and everybody gets taken up to Ulmer Polzeg's estate, which is this kind of exotic Art Deco castle. And then we find out that Polzeg actually has married Werdegast's wife, and then when she died, he married her daughter. It's a twisted little flick, especially considering we were just getting into the Hays Code, coming into its full flower. Aaron, do you want to speak kind of like to that context of where, because it's amazing that this film is so perverse, and yet it's coming at a time when they're really starting to clamp down.
Kind of unlike the comics code, which happens a couple decades later. The Hays Code was it was a gradient. It was a more gradual sort of thing, like you allude to. And I think it's fascinating that this one happens as that's beginning, because it is, I think, the most of, literally, in my estimation, of any Universal film, and I mean any Universal film from the classic golden horror era, this is the one that packs the most punch, the most shocking from cover to cover. I mean, you get into it and you realize what's happening here. And I think as you dig into what's going on, and like I talked about earlier, some of the metaphorical content, you just see that this was a movie that was playing at a completely different level than anything that was, that it was, in its contemporary sort of field of vision. And so, yeah, I mean, as we talk more about the rest of the plot, I've got a lot to say, but I don't want to get there until we get there. But I will say, I wanted to mention one thing that I think is so critical. This is a story about the past in so many ways, and people who can't dig themselves out of the trench of the past that they've created for themselves through their decisions and their processes. And I think it's so important that Ulmer and the other writer was Peter Rurik, that they made the decision to have, I always talk about the character, the witness, the one who helps the audience see what's going on, the ones that give us context and give us a way into the story. And that's what these two do. And I think it's so critical, because it feels like they were sort of created as a newlywed couple because that was convenient. It gave them a reason to be traveling in Austria, because, like everybody goes on their honeymoon to Austria. But it's important, I think, foundationally for this picture, because what it says is, here's a couple, your witness couple, the people who are going to watch this happen, are also in this sort of the most artificially optimistic point in their lives. They're at a point in their lives where their job culturally is to think about everything great that's about to happen in their lives. And that is such an important counterpoint to what's going on in the rest of this movie. So not only is it perverse, and we'll get into all kinds of that stuff too, but I think it's also, like I said, it is packed with implicit content and interesting things that make it, I mean, this must have been a strange one for the kids in the 50s, the monster kids, in the 60s. I'm not old enough for that. I was born in 1973, but I just think that this one, after a movie that certainly plays with adult themes, but is more enjoyable as a kid's, if you're a kid, like even Frankenstein or Dracula, that this movie might have been a little confusing whenever you were 8 years old, when you get to the, wife hanging in the basement and the skinning alive.
Well, and I think that, when you talk about like the kids of the 50s, I'm like, what about the kids of the 30s or the 40s? Like, I mean, I'm just imagining like what audiences of the day made of it. You talked about the implicit qualities. I mean, there's an explicit, this is the first time I think that we've seen like Satanists, proudly portrayed and explicitly portrayed on screen. Like there is a cult of Satanists that does human sacrifice,
The 1934 version of Hostel, very innocent going to Europe, and it turns out Europe is full of bad stuff that happened, and it's still haunting. It's like they have no idea what they're getting into. And I think it's because evil is contextualized in this as Satanists against God. And so perhaps it's one of the reasons why, they could accept the movie. The other thing about it, of course, is the design, because as much as it takes place in Europe, it takes place in a castle that's really like a gun emplacement and with Bauhaus architecture. And it's like there's a tendency for Universal movies taking place in some kind of Europe. It's got castles, it's got peasants, we're somewhere. In this case, the First World War hangs over everything, and the design is unlike anything else.
I'd like to talk kind of like we alluded to earlier about Lugosi being the hero in this, and kind of unambiguously so in the reshoots that took place. Bobby, how was that for you? Like in terms of because Lugosi primarily he loved to play those charismatic villains, in White Zombie, we'd see him as Dracula, obviously. How was it for you seeing, your Dracula as a good guy?
It was such a switch. I remember because this was the first time I ever saw him playing the hero, and I didn't believe it at first the first time I saw it, because the thing is, you still feel that's in Lugosi intensity underneath. I was like waiting for him to be, he's got to be a villain. He's got to be a villain. For me, it's such a cool plot twist, like at the end when he goes insane. Because then you it's like the moment you've been waiting for, but way better than you imagined. So I think it works really great as a twist to the story.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned Aaron that our ostensible heroic figure of David Manners, he doesn't really do much in the way that is heroic. He cedes that to Lugosi time and again to kind of carry out the wheels of justice.
Yeah, and I just think it's such an interesting thing that David Manners, I remember reading somewhere that Katharine Hepburn said, I knew I'd made it when I was in a movie with David Manners. I mean, he was a huge, huge celebrity in that moment, and I still can't quite figure out why. He's always kind of, room temperature in everything he is in. I mean, he's compelling, he's charismatic, but I don't feel like I feel like you could give him a baseball bat with nails in it and he still wouldn't be threatening somehow. And that's a fascinating thing, but I don't know that it's right to characterize him in this role as having been someone who was intended to be the sort of rough and tumble hero. I do think that was Lugosi's task in this film. And I think that the bravery of Ulmer to make the decision to give Lugosi this incredible phobia that stops him from carrying out his stated activity time and time again. I mean, these are warriors. These are people who went to war. And I'm fascinated, by the way. I don't want to go too far into it because I could talk about this forever, but I love this film. And one of the reasons I love this film so much is that I'm fascinated with World War I, and it's specifically its impact on arts that happened after it. I mean, the horror genre exists, in my opinion, would not exist the way that it exists now without World War I. We wouldn't have gotten The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Right.
We wouldn't have gotten The Golem. We wouldn't have gotten a lot of these films, in my opinion, in the way that they came out without World War I. And there's a book that I'm super fond of. It's called Nothing But the Clouds Unchanged, and it's about artists' reaction to World War I. And it's such a compelling title for this reason, and this is why I think it's so important to bring it up. Nothing But the Clouds Unchanged is titled thusly because the war was fought by rural people who had never seen an industrial war. And here's the first one, the first human meat grinder in human history. And what those men saw when they went to war was unlike anything in human experience. As bad as war was, and it was bad, always bad, this was a new kind of bad. And the psychological scar that it left on our entire planet and on the entire consciousness of our planet is hard to remember after World War II just kind of eclipsed it, right? Just shortly thereafter. But there's this really intense moment that happens from 1918 until pretty much 1939, where we are just as a culture digesting what had happened in World War I. And that's what this movie is completely all about doing. And I think that it does such a really interesting job. And I think that it does one of the most interesting things in cinema history with that sequence where they go to the basement and they literally descend down into the past. And then, well, I don't know if I want to get there. I'm monologuing, so I'll stop. But I want to talk about what that scene does at some point. So if we can come back to it.
One of the things that is amazing to me, and it kind of goes with what Aaron was saying, I work as a tour guide. So I've spent a long time inside a gun emplacement that was built in that era. That great scene gun chart, it's really based on what those things look like. So for me, there's this real sense of the war that comes through because of how that place is designed when you go down into its depth. The one I worked in had concrete like that, wasn't quite as fancy. And it was a gun emplacement that was built for long-range guns in the late 1800s. Lugosi, when he sees the cat, he's against that gun chart things up on the big clear thing, kind of reminds me of Star Wars too, where they have the big glass, tracking thing. But, essentially that there's equipment like that so that you can shoot, track where you've shot, try to get closer to where you're shooting. It's all accurate in there, and it's all underground. So you descend from heaven into hell. It's pretty cool.
And this movie was the biggest hit for Universal in 1934. Like the reteaming of Karloff and Lugosi really did pay off in that respect. But there was, of course, that sense of a rivalry. I think somebody alluded to it earlier, of Lugosi was coming back and really wanting to make a good impression and kind of turn his career back around. Karloff was coming back kind of, at the height of his powers. And it was seen as an opportunity to get two monsters for the price of one, even though it was just monsters in terms of these horror stars, which is how they'd been established at that point. As you alluded, Aaron, like there is a lot more going on below the surface. Stan just talked about what happens up in the Art Deco area, but then you go down and I think it is a descent into human depravity. Like that is the Polzig that we're being exposed to, is that he's gone beyond the pale. He is performing things that are inhuman, that are against God, etc. Is that kind of a good lead into some of the metaphors that you want to chat about?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, this movie is just packed with metaphoric content. And so I love Pelzig's profession. I love the opportunity that it gives him to be a designer and to work in Art Deco, because Art Deco is really this accelerating futurism, right? It leads us right into modernism. It leads us right into, I love cars from the 50s because the stance is like, it looks like it's going fast even when it's sitting still. And that's what Art Deco was all about. It was like the prototype of that, and so you've got Pelzig, who in a lot of ways is looking to an artificial future that he's trying like hell to create. That's what his whole MO is. But what he's really doing is running from the past. And then you've got this other character, Vitus Werdegast, who can't unstick himself from his past, and he can't climb out of it. And so they have to go to the basement together, which means literally descending into the old fortress, which has now been turned into this weird sort of charnel house that isn't. So one of the things that I love here too is that, and I think in a modern film they would have done it this way, when we go down and we see Werdegast's wife hanging, there is no death. She looks like she could wake up at any second. And so there's this weird suspension of death, even though the space that they're in is ludicrously about death. That's what it's a metaphor for. And if you're not sure of it, there's a monologue that happens to make sure that you get the point. And he says, are we the less victims of war than those whose bodies were torn asunder? Are we not both the living dead? And then they got one of the most amazing things about this film. After they go through that monologue and he says that, then the camera comes upstairs, the POV of what we should see when they're coming back up out of the past, but we don't, because they've just declared themselves to be ghosts. And basically now we have this POV of not people, but just ghosts coming up the stairs. And it's almost like that The men who we watch enact this drama, they're just scarecrows. They're just soulless nothings, husks that are left, that are the byproduct of this war that killed them spiritually 15 years previously. And I just think that, you know, this is heavy stuff for a horror movie in 1934.
Even the phone is dead.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. Like the notion that like we are surrounded by death. And my understanding was that Jack Pierce was given this film to work on as the makeup guy. His instructions, because there's not a monster in this movie, but his instructions were to make Karloff look like the living incarnation of Satan. And I'm curious to hear, Bobby, why don't you kick things off? Like, what are your feelings about like Karloff, his appearance and his performance in this film?
I love his look in this movie. Like the hair is perfect, the eye makeup, his outfit. And we know like he's not a monster. He's got all the accessories of a monster, and he does such a great job. Last time I was watching it, I was reminded of how in Frankenstein, how he doesn't need dialogue to convey so much character. And there are so many scenes where it's quiet. But you look at his face and you look at his eyes, and it tells you so much what he's planning and thinking.
I mean, I think one of the joys of the movie is the two facing off against each other. Like that's one of the things that, you know, it's two actors who are feeding off each other and work together so well, sort of this yin and yang.
Yeah, I would say that the way that Karloff and Lugosi are pitted against one another, they would do other films and they would trade kind of like who is the hero and who is the villain. It really seems like this is kind of that perfect distillment of watching both of them playing to their strengths, because Lugosi is more restrained than we see him in other pairings. And Karloff, as a couple of people have mentioned, he is so restrained as well. And so you're watching these kind of like two tightly wound instruments of acting that are, it's like a chess match, right? That we see literally played out later. They're both being very calculating as to when is the opportunity for me to shine and when do I recede to let my scene partner shine. I don't feel like they are trying to steal from one another. I don't get a sense of mugging to try and steal scenes. I get a real sense of play back and forth of both recognizing the other's talents and wanting to play at a higher level. You know, like it's being as good as your opponent.
Oh yeah, I agree. And I think both of the roles are so well written. You know, like Bela Lugosi's role, he was able to bring back his memories of serving in World War One. The roles are like they're challenging them as actors to really bring out their best. They play so well together. I think that was interesting, as you were saying. Oh, this is really the best example of the combining them. It's so weird because like the other ones, they don't do what you would think. Whereas like a lot of like in The Raven, it's
Right.
Bela Lugosi, he's the head, and then Boris Karloff is just like his assistant. Whereas this is the two actors against each other.
Yeah, they're equal.
They're equal, yeah. And it's really it's the predecessor of Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, King Kong meets Godzilla, and Freddy versus Jason. You know, even I noticed even in the fight scene, neither one of them comes off as being more powerful than the other. They both put up a good fight. Bela Lugosi wins because he has his servant helping him. Right. But if that fight just kept going, just the two of them, they really feel like physical strength equals.
That's a great point.
It must have been really interesting to talk to both Karloff and Lugosi at that time, because I can't imagine what it was like. You know, even by this point, writers were already writing about the pathos that Karloff could pull off with the Frankenstein monster. And in this film, all the pathos goes to Lugosi, right? But on the other hand, I think that Helmar Pulzig is one of the most interesting designs for a character, literally in the history of the medium. You can't take your eyes off of him if he's in the frame. He is electrifying and magnetic. And so it must have been really interesting because in some ways they're both playing kind of the opposite of the character that, in a metaphorical way, they're playing opposite of the characters that they got famous for, because the Dracula character was so striking. When Lugosi was on screen as Dracula, you can't take your eyes off of him. And in this, even though he's very well dressed in this, as soon as Karloff walks in the room, you're not looking at Lugosi anymore, just because he looks like electricity. I mean, he's giving off a vibe. And so it's almost like in so many ways, they're taking that, they consciously took the past that they're very recently coming from and playing on that past. And I was thinking that maybe I was making that up a little bit much, but then I watched it again the other day and I was like, oh yeah, there's a moment where Pelzig actually sits up in bed like a vampire, like that, sits straight up. And I was like, that's got to be deliberate. That has to be them quoting, And so I don't know. Maybe it's too much time spent with these things over the years that makes you see things that maybe weren't there. But in my mind, this film is a cinephile's dream because it at least is recognizing the importance, the sort of giant Godzilla-sized cultural footprint that these men put down in the very recent past, and the real big hope that the filmmakers had that they were about to put that same size footprint down for this film.
It is amazing to think about the fact that like this is only 3 years from Dracula and Frankenstein. And like as you said, like the impact that those two films had on the cinematic landscape.
I love the pajamas. I want both Lugosi's pajamas and Karloff's pajamas. Apparently, what was it? They sold recently for $86,000 or something for a while.
Which is like the budget of the movie.
The budget of the movie, yeah. And apparently Jacqueline Wells was crushing on him too. And I can see that, he's very, I don't know, he's kind of timeless. You know what I mean?
You kind of mentioned it, Aaron, that this film doesn't get the same kind of acclaim as the other Universal, monster films do. And yet I think among aficionados, we all recognize this as an incredible effort coming out of Universal. I know I wanted to make sure it was included in my book, Horror 101, because I feel like it is essential viewing. And I'm curious, Bobby, if you kick us off, like, why is it you feel like this movie maybe doesn't get the same attention as some of the other Universal classics?
I feel like the monsters are easier to market. Dracula, everyone knows what that is. Frankenstein, everyone knows what that is. Whereas these are more human characters. So and then as we were talking about earlier, like Dracula and Frankenstein, I think you could hit them when they're 5 years old and they'll dig it. Whereas this, you have to. You could grow up watching it, but it doesn't. It has a bigger impact like later on.
It's a more like an adult kind of horror.
Right. Yeah. I would almost want like an example, like why the Three Stooges seem to be more popular than the Marx Brothers. Because the Three Stooges, you could show them when they're little and they'll get it.
But they don't generate the same kind of esteem and critical recognition. But they do resonate with a broader audience, perhaps.
Right. Yeah.
Aaron, how about you?
Culture is not really a stream. Culture is more like the debris that collects in a stream, right? And what we get at the end of the cultural process is not something that's been purified. It's whatever collects up. And I think that it's so important to remember. I'm such a fan and historian of the Monster Kid era because it shifted our culture and it created the horror fandom as we know it now. And without that, we would not have the cultural understanding and legacy that we do of these monsters, right? And so much like you were saying, Bobby, I think that it's just a matter of what played best to an 11-year-old boy from 1958 to 1968 was what has created the cultural legacy for Universal Horror. And this is a grown-up horror movie. It really is. I mean, I remember it from being a kid and I was not that impressed with it. Like everybody else, I watched it on TV because it was a horror movie that was on TV. And if there was a horror movie on TV, I was watching it, but I have very little memory of it. But coming back to it as a grown-up and seeing it again and looking at the people I was with going, what in the hell is going on in this movie? I can't believe I'm seeing what I'm seeing. So that's one of the delightful things about it, though, because I feel like, so here's what happened with me, my own personal story. I have gone through phases in my life where I've even kind of gotten away from the horror genre, but I've never gotten away from the Universal monster films. They've always been like my favorite cookie. I can always come back to them, even whenever horror leaves me with a little bit of anxiety, which has happened in the past to me a couple of times. But that created a really nice opportunity for me, because I got to a point where some corner of my brain was like, I understand everything I need to know about Universal Horror. And then I came back to Universal Horror like a decade ago and dug back into the Black Cat again for the first time in a while. And all of a sudden I was like, I don't understand anything about Universal Horror. I need to go and reevaluate everything I think I know, because this movie is just as shocking in 2024, if you've never seen it, as it was in 1934.
I wanted to bring up like the climax when Bela Lugosi skins Boris Karloff alive.
Yes.
Because like that scene especially, he is so intense in that scene. And I think that's why that, like, to me, that always goes down as one of his most frightening film moments. Because it's like, even when he says it, he like sort of mispronounces tear and says it fair, but it's because he's so into what he's doing, he doesn't care. You know, like be used to him as Dracula and Murder Legendary, to be have it together, very sophisticated. It's a mind-blowing to see him just completely lose it.
No, and that scene in particular, that was one that as a child, it never occurred to me that humans could do that to one another. Like, that was for me a glimpse into the capacity for evil and for sadism. One of the other ones, and Stan, you'll get a kick out of this, but it was one of I think it's the Gamera movie, Gamera versus Baragon, where they are down in a cave and they're looking for the opal. And one of them sees a scorpion climbing on the leg, and he sees it and he doesn't say anything. And I always kind of like connect that and the Black Cat as these two moments of like the depths to which humanity is willing and able to descend. It's like, no, I won't save you from that scorpion, and I will flay the skin from your body because that's the only appropriate revenge I can think of. And I was like, my little 8-year-old mind is just exploding. And of course, I'm watching this late at night, and there's nobody to talk to about this. So this is my much belated therapy session. Thank you all for attending.
That scene with the scorpion, my oldest son was driven crazy by that. It was like, oh my God, what are you showing me? This is supposed to be a Gamera movie. Can I just hop back for a second?
Please.
To the idea that, this film, it's kind of not as well known. One of the things I think might be a factor in that is that there is this, tragedy for Ulmer around this film, that he had an affair with a woman who was married to one of the Lemleys. And for that reason, he got blacklisted. He never made another film. But this was Universal's, most successful movie of 1934. So if Ulmer had more opportunities, because he was really involved in the writing as well as the directing and the planning of this movie, if he had made more films like this and Universal had taken up based on the fact it had been so successful, I think maybe, when you look at Ulmer's stuff, he makes incredible contributions to film noir and other genres.
I think that if Ulmer had had more opportunities, this film would be important as an Edgar Ulmer movie.
Yeah,
we would talk about him with more reverence, with the same reverence that we do talk about James Whale and Carl Freund, the legacy that they leave behind. As you say, Edgar Ulmer left some incredible pieces of cinema behind. Detour is the quintessential no budget noir, and it is required viewing for anybody who loves movies. But it's funny to see him working with a Universal budget. Also, I do want to just kind of mention really quick, this budget for this film was like a third of what they put out for Frankenstein, and it's like a quarter of what they put out for Dracula. And so the fact that they were able to pull it off for less money, also considering they weren't paying Karloff a ton of money for Frankenstein, and he got paid a lot more money for this one. So I'm thinking, okay, a lot of the budget went to that. It's really kind of remarkable where this film lands and how it lands. But the idea of watching Ulmer with this budget versus Ulmer with his no budget for Detour, and you get to see what an incredible artist he is.
maybe if the whole problem with the Lemleys had never happened, we'd be talking about the Ulmer's past as a horror director for Universal, and then how he went on to make film noirs.
Right, right, like a Robert
would be
Wise type of situation.
Yeah, it would be a different kind of story, but unfortunately, that was not to be.
Something I noticed, really paid attention to when watching it last time, is how well every shot is composed. What great composition it was, and the amazing set too. It really is like that house is a world of its own.
Yeah, Charles D. Hall is our art director.
I mean, was he? You know what I mean? This was during the time at Universal where, like, he was the art director because he's the name on literally every Universal film, but he had a whole staff, and I always wonder how much Charles D. Hall actually did. It's kind of like the makeup man at Universal in the 50s, right? The Westmores.
Yep, for sure. But since his name is on the title, I got to give it to him.
There is some amazing camera work. There's one, I think it's just a reaction shot where the camera kind of glides around during a 2-shot conversation, so it can pick up the reaction, and it's an elaborate camera move for something like that. I love the shadow work, and I mean, he was sort of inspired by Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, I think, as well as Nosferatu, and I mean, he gives all those expressionistic films he may or may not have actually contributed to in his bio. Apparently, there's a lot of contention about whether he really worked on the Golem or Metropolis, which were things he said that he had worked on, but there's no evidence for it. But I mean, they clearly worked on his mind, in terms of design when he was making film.
Yeah, the cinematography here is John J. Mescal, who also did Bride of Frankenstein. It's no joke, he's no slouch, and he worked with Arthur Edison on The Invisible Man, I guess. So great stuff. Although I would throw my vote in that it's I don't know that it looks quite as grand as Frankenstein, but I think it's close.
It definitely succeeds in creating its own world, and that's what because I do feel it's not quite as the laboratory in Frankenstein is huge, but it has its own vibe, and I think that's what I love so much about the Black Cat. Is it's just the vibe of it it's indescribable.
Yeah, the mise en scène in this film is super important. I mean, how they arrange things, what they do with the sets, I think brave decision to make that basement so spare, the smart decision to make that final crazy ritual have all those echoes of World War I with those crossed, like whatever you call that thing that you hide behind in no man's land that you string barbed wire all over, that makes the war that much more horrifying. And the fact that would be the sort of the way that he would create his whole ritual space is in a reflection, an Art Deco reflection of this war that he's clearly consciously trying to escape. And I would also say another metaphor that I like a lot is that the person who profits from war becomes a Satanist. I'm not sure what the chicken and egg on that one is, but
I love the design in there. I know that they were advised they shouldn't have an upside down cross. The way it's shot, it is an upside down cross until they pull back, and you see that it's more like some kind of barrier from the war. I love those objects behind, the way Karloff looks. All of it looks just so theatrical. I know there was going to be a scene where the Satanists came, and you got to see them as they came into the house, and I kind of missed that. That would have been a cool moment, I think, in terms of the things that they had to cut out. Probably not necessarily contribute that much to the film. And the connections to Aleister Crowley at the time, and the fact that they were riffing on basically probably the most well-known Satanist of that era, maybe ever. It's pretty amazing.
One more thing I want to say about that final scene is you get to play my favorite game in classic horror history, and you can play it from about 1930 until about 1970, and it's holy shit, is that John Carradine? And, and sure enough,
Seeing Gregory Mank points out on the Blu-ray that Shout Factory put out that, you see John Carradine in the back as one of the Satanists. And he also, I guess, is the one who's playing the organ, at the, during the final ritual. And I'm like, because then John Carradine would come and he would do Bluebeard. Yeah. A couple of years later with Ulmer.
think to your point, it's really this is an interesting moment in human history too, because we'd come through the sort of mediumistic era, but there was, like you said, there's Aleister Crowley in the news, and there's this new exploration that's happening of mediumship that, like I said, we're already kind of through that era, and it goes back to Edgar Allan Poe's time, but that's happening during this film. And so I think it's brave to talk about Satanism in any film from this era at a time when 96% of Americans were, avowedly Christian. But it's even more to show the ritual. I mean, it's not even just that he is a Satanist. Right. We get a satanic ritual, and we don't see that again until the 60s, really. I mean, it's a long time before they trot out that kind of thing.
Although we did get to
it is what.
Well, I was simply going to say that Bobby and you and I, Stan, we talked about another group of Satanists when we were talking about the seventh victim for Val Lewton.
Right.
I feel like it was rare then. We were like, oh, what they talk about Satan just right out in the open there.
I mean, there's a little tinge of it in Son of Dracula, in a weird way, because she's not only obsessed with him, but she's obsessed with spiritism and stuff.
Well, let's go ahead and offer any final thoughts about the Black Cat and the Karloff, Lugosi, Ulmer, etc. Any final thoughts you'd like to throw out?
Just honestly, this is one of my favorite Bela Lugosi movies. It's such a powerful performance he gives. You feel when he is giving his monologues about World War I. You feel the reality in it, and then he gets that great moment at the end when he skins Boris Karloff alive. So I think, and then Boris Karloff is great in it too. It's a great pairing. And speaking of it as a universal horror film, it has that great trademark of every character is great. Because I know we talked about the big ones, but I was thinking about the Boris Karloff's, like the butler, the one who looks like Barnabas Collins. Like, it's a cool look. Like, and then Karen with the hair. It's like every character feels so iconic in it.
I can't be clearer. I think this is one of those films that if you haven't seen it or haven't seen it for a while, it bears repetition, and it bears repetition even if you have seen it recently. I see this movie about annually, and I love to watch it again, and I love to go read about it because other people, smarter people than me, have thought about really interesting angles about this film. And I'm always interested in the kind of connectivity to the past and the future that any piece of art has, specifically film. And this one feels like it has a lot. It reaches into the past, it reaches into the future. It obviously, we've talked about, it brings two icons together and it allows them to swish around the roles that they've been most famous for. It is a film that is, I think, infinitely interesting for context about its time, but also as just a standalone experience. There's so much packed in there that you can't go wrong with a first-time viewing or a reviewing of The Black Cat, in my opinion.
Drama has warped both of these individuals, and how they're both coming to terms with. It's pretty strong stuff still.
Well, thank you all so much. This was a really great conversation, and I immediately want to go back and revisit it again because it is that kind of film that I feel like you, as Aaron pointed out, that there's always going to be something new you pick up, even if it's just the repetition of it. You recognize that image or that moment or that line of dialogue resonates in a way that is just really incredible. And I think that's the mark of a great horror film, a great film in general. Looking forward to having you all back on again very soon. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.